In this video, we're going to cover cavalry. We're going to talk about the unit size, essentially how many perhaps you should have in a corps, the difference between the two different types of cavalry in this game, what sort of weapons should you equip your cavalry with, and then finally tactics, how to use your cavalry on the battlefield. So you really have two options when you're dealing with cavalry on the battlefield, how to use it, either alone or dependently. So when I say dependent, what do I mean? I essentially mean in support of the rest of your army. So attached to the army and working in conjunction with other infantry or what have you. Independently, you would detach those cavalry from the rest of your army and have them, basically operate on their own, doing their own thing, whatever that may be. Generally speaking, you're going to be doing that with your skirmishing cavalry. So skirmishing cavalry are equipped with carbines, and so they're effectively infantry on horseback. And because of that, they're far more effective at operating on their own because they don't have to be in close quarters with anybody to deal any kind of any sort of damage or affect morale of the enemy. Your shock cavalry, on the other hand, is going to be your melee cavalry, and they're going to have to be very, very up close and personal to do anything. And so generally speaking, you're probably going to want to be using them as a support role rather than independently doing their own thing. That being said, both types of cavalry have very effective uses in terms of intel gathering, harassing artillery, and seizing supply wagons, and dealing with other cavalry. So I don't want to say that saying melee cavalry has to be in support of the army is necessarily like the end all. I'd say, though, probably you're going to find yourself 70-75% of the time using them as a support unit, whereas your skirmish cavalry, if you so choose, you can detach it and use it independent of that. So now what is it cavalry cannot do before we talk about all the things that they can do? They cannot go toe-to-toe with really anybody. Kind of really even other skirmishers, to be honest with you, even if skirmishers have fewer in number. Because skirmishing units tend to be quicker than infantry, so they run faster, so they're harder to flag down as a cavalry. And they have longer range, so they can get off several volleys on your cavalry before you can actually engage them. And your cavalry, as we're going to discuss here, is expensive. It's expensive to maintain. It's expensive to equip. So you just don't want to be putting yourself in circumstances where your cavalry are going to be shot at, if possible. All right. So you can't go toe-to-toe with really anybody. And even if you're going up against another cavalry unit, you generally want to have two units to their one. That way you can outnumber them and minimize your casualties. In another video, I'm going to talk about scaling and how scaling affects this game. It doesn't do you any good to inflict just as many casualties on the enemy as they inflict on you, because the AI gets built-in benefits that you don't get, namely scaling, which means you may kill off, say an entire cavalry unit, and he kills off almost yours entire one, but he gets those men back in the next battle, probably. You don't, not unless you spend the money, the men, and the guns to do it. So, the biggest weakness they have is two infantry, and then two, basically the skirmishers, long range units, because infantry have much larger numbers, and so a single volley can kill. Say you have 500 troopers, a single volley could kill off 100 of those, right? So you already lose a fifth of your army, or a fifth of that unit from a single volley, because there's just so many infantry in a unit generally. And then also for skirmishers, they have just longer range, and they usually don't have a whole lot less men than you do in that particular unit, so they can really kind of pick you off from a distance. Now their strengths, though, are against artillery, because artillery is very slow moving, so you can either catch it when it's limbered up and moving by horseback, or hit it in the rear. As you know, artillery takes a long time to turn, so if you hit it in its rear, you can usually do some pretty good damage and then get out of there before they have a chance to turn around and put canister into you. Supply wagons, obviously, because supply wagons are really slow, so you can capture those pretty easily with cavalry. And then also supporting your infantry, so dealing with preoccupied infantry, I like to say, whether it's an enemy infantry unit that's engaged in melee with yours, or one that's shooting on your infantry and you're able to bring the cavalry in the rear or the flank and hit the infantry while it's distracted and not shooting at your cavalry. Cavalry are really good for helping with breakthroughs and collapsing flanks. So breakthroughs, I'm going to show you later on in this video a circumstance where I charge the enemy with half the number of infantry than my enemy, and then I only bring in like 75 cavalry. But because cavalry is very good at melee and I hit him in his flank, he ended up routing and collapsing. So really good support unit. And then just really kind of harassing the flanks of the enemy and kind of keeping the enemy off balance and keeping your own flanks clean. Bear in mind that the micro for your particular units is going to vary depending on whether you use skirmish cavalry or melee cavalry. I would say if you're better at micro, then maybe you want to go with the skirmish cavalry. If not, probably stick with the melee, because melee is going to be closer to your overall army, so you're not going to have to keep as close of tabs on them as you might your skirmish cavalry, depending on how you use them. Again, you don't have to detach your skirmish cavalry, but that's something to keep in mind. Let's talk about perks here really quick before we go into weapon choice. So for perks, if you're going to go with your skirmish cavalry, which are identified by the rifle that goes over the horse's shoulder, is that there? Is that there? Different than your melee, which they don't have that. Now I say melee, they do have a firearm. It's just the range is very, very short. It's like almost like a pistol. So just bear that in mind. But your skirmish cavalry are, no kidding, they have carbines, right? So they actually can do damage from horseback. They can also dismount. I don't know if I'd already mentioned it, but a good way to use skirmish cavalry is if there's a defensive position that you want to seize, because they're on horseback, they're very fast, they can get there quickly before the enemy does. You can then dismount them and then use them like infantry until your infantry is actually able to get up and seize that position and hold it. That's a really good way to use them. You can also use them as skirmishers. So if you have skirmish cavalry in your unit, probably don't need to go with an actual skirmishing unit. You can, but you can use your skirmish cavalry as skirmishers. And although the actual long guns for the skirmishing units are better, which I'll go over later on in this episode, you can use these guys almost as effectively. So just keep that in mind. Okay, but for perks, I would say for skirmish, go with horseback riding, cavalry training, and shock cavalry. Reason is that that's for melee. So for skirmish cavalry, go with horseback riding, scouting, and mounted infantry. There we go. So again, horseback riding, scouting, mounted infantry. What that does is that maximizes your speed and your accuracy for those particular units. So I'd go with those 3 traits. For your melee, go with horseback riding, cavalry training, and shock cavalry. So what that's going to do is going to boost your melee across the board. And I think that tends to be the best combination for melee cavalry. So cavalry training, or horseback riding, cavalry training, and shock cavalry. How many units should you have per corps? I'd say generally 2 or 3 per corps, I think, is a good number. I'd say at a minimum 2. Because my rule of thumb is you should always be using them in tandem with each other, not just by themselves as one, but 2, for a couple reasons. One, if you come across another cavalry unit, you always want to be able to outnumber your opponent. You certainly don't want to be in a position where he has 2 and you have 1, right? At least you want 2 and 2. But number 2, they work really well in tandem with each other. You can use one to bait the enemy and just kind of keep yourself out of firing range, but bait the enemy, and use the other one to go around the flank or the rear. It's almost like the raptors, the velociraptors in Jurassic Park. You know, like using one to bait the enemy and the other one to come around and hit the flank and the rear. It's really effective, and I show you how to do that with my skirmishing cav later on in this episode. So say 2 to 3 per corps, I think is a good number. Again, if you have skirmish cavalry, you don't necessarily need to have actual skirmishing units as well. You can kind of use them for that. If you have melee cavalry, then I would say probably have a skirmishing unit or 2 to kind of round out your army. And then as far as weapons are concerned, so what I did is I pulled various units here. So first for your skirmish cavalry, let's see here, make sure I get this. You're going to start off, you want to start off with the Sharps Model 1855. This is going to go for both the Union and the Confederates. And really the reason is if you look at the stats on it, the effective range is really good. It's 230. To put it in perspective, right, the infield or the Lorenz, which is going to be, it's kind of like the middle of the road rifle in the game. Its range is 340, so it's not too much off from this. Whereas look at the fire rate, 86. Whereas your fire rate with the musket's only 40. So it's a pretty good weapon to have for your mounted infantry, which is what these guys are. They're mounted infantry. And then later on, get the 1861 infield, which is better range. I would say that some people have mentioned instead of going with the model 1855, they like to go with like the Smith or the Sharp. So Smith. Well, anyways, the Smith is going to be $52 per. But the Sharp is only 34. So that's why I like going with this one. It's cheaper. 34. We can't get the Smith here, but you might be able to get the Smith with the Union. Again, I would recommend going with the 1855 Sharp because it's cheaper and just almost as good. And then go with the 1861 infield pattern later on in the game. Now, the 1861 Spencer Carbine is, so let me just back up really quick. Kind of mid-game, what you probably will be able to do is get the 1859 Sharps. Sure, the Sharps model 1859. I would go up for that, either until you can afford and get these, or basically to upgrade these. So upgrade those to 1859 mid-game or so. A couple other guns that are really good, but you probably won't be able to get them, at least with the CSA, because they're just not in large supply, is the Maynard, the Burnside, the Wesson, or the Spencer, the 1861 Spencer Carbine. Now, the 1861 Spencer is the best one you can get. That is awesome. You just might not be able to outfit a large contingent of your unit with that particular gun. So just bear that in mind. And then the Maynard is, again, it's really expensive. It's nice, but it can be harder to get a large enough number of it to supply your units if you're the CSA, if you're not capturing these. Same thing goes for the Burnside and the Wesson. Now, those three, the Maynard, the Burnside, and the Wesson, you may be able to get in bulk as the Union later in the game, and if that's the case, then you may want to look at those. But for the CSA, you're looking at really the 55 Sharp, the 59 Sharp, or the pattern 1861 infield. Okay. Now for your melee cavalry, you got a couple different ones. You're going to start off with your Palmetto 1842, and that's pretty standard for both, I think, the Union and CSA. You can also start off with the Colt 1855. So I don't know if I got, yeah, so here's a Colt 1855. So what's the difference? So your Palmetto, you still get the 100 melee. Your Colt, you're going to have 100 melee. Your range is going to be 75 with both. But your fire rate and your damage is going to be a little bit different. So your damage is 17, your fire rate 75. Your damage is going to be 11, but your fire rate's 200. Right? So it depends on kind of what you want to go with. You want to do damage, you want to do fire rate. I like the Colt 1855, honestly. That's what I like to start off with. And here's the reason why. I'm using my melee guys for melee, right? And if I'm shooting at my enemy, I'm not doing it to really inflict a lot of casualties. I'm doing it to shake up their morale. I'm doing it to cause them to rout. So I don't really need to do a lot of damage to be effective with my melee cavalry if I'm shooting at them, right? That being said, the Palmetto is, I want to say it's cheaper also. It's $40 for the Colt, and the Palmetto is $30. So in terms of value, Palmettos are great value. So it's just a matter of how you want to do it. Your fire rate's 75. Your fire rate with the Colt's going to be 200 though, so you can get a lot more shots off. Also, too, bear in mind that the more shots your unit gets off, the more rapidly their firearm skill goes up, because these skills go up as you use them. So this is also a really good way to get this unit trained up, is having them get a lot of volleys off. So just kind of keep that in mind. Then eventually you want to upgrade to this. So the Lamette, this is awesome. This is a fantastic gun. It is expensive, obviously, 93, but it is awesome. Because it not only has a much better melee, so you got 136 melee instead of 100, but you also have a rate of fire of 250. And then the damage isn't too bad either, 12.5. So eventually you want to get with this. A lot of people, I'd say the game tends to outfit you with this Remington 1861. I don't like this gun at all, and here's the reason why. It's melee cavalry, right? So the strength is melee. And yet for this guy, the melee is 91, which I think is one of the lowest melees for a unit available. I want to say it's probably the lowest. I don't know if there's anything much lower for a melee unit.
Yes, sir.
And then, the gun itself isn't that great either. So it does 12.5 damage. Okay. The fire rate's okay. Pretty good. But you're not going to be using these guys for shooting. I mean, that's kind of your secondary, right? Their primary is melee. So it just seems to try and give you a skirmishing cavalry unit on a melee unit. Just doesn't make sense to me. So I usually don't use the Remington. I usually, again, use this guy, the Lamette, late game, and then early game, the Colt 1855 or the Palmetto 1842. Let's see. Did I see anything else I want to cover here before I switch over to the demos? Oh, that's right. So size. I can't recall if I have mentioned this before yet, but you want to go with between 500 and 750 in terms of your unit size for your cavalry. The reason being is that one volley from an infantry unit could really tear you up. It could kill up to 100 dudes. If you only have a 300 size force and you lose 100 guys, you're kind of already close to routing at that point. Your morale is going to just plummet. If you have 5 to 750, you're going to be able to absorb a few volleys before you get into that precarious situation of having really low morale. That's the first reason. The second is, as the game progresses, the enemy is going to be bringing large cavalry-sized units, and so if you want to use your cavalry as an anti-cavalry type unit, or at least have that option, you're going to want to have your size a little bit bigger to deal with that. Now, that's not to say that having a smaller unit is not bad, or is a bad thing. The smaller the unit, the quicker it's going to gain in experience. And also, too, the smaller the unit, the lower the ranking officer is. So if you're hard up for, say, colonels, this 250 unit can be effectively run by a major. So he's high enough rank. So this can give him experience, get him trained up to be a lieutenant colonel. So you can use these smaller units to train up newer officers. If you were to bump him up to, say, 500, do this one here. So say we bumped him up to 500.
Yes, sir.
He is now not high enough rank, and I think you need a full bird to now oversee this particular unit.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, I tend to like using my higher ranking officers on my infantry, and then use my other units a little bit smaller to train up other units. So just keep that in mind, that it's not a terrible idea to have a smaller cavalry unit, because they will gain experience faster, can be led by a lower ranking officer. Just you gotta be careful with them, right? You're not gonna be able to really use them against other cavalry necessarily unless they're supported by other ones. And then you're gonna just have to be really careful to make sure they don't get tore up. But that's something. Finally, just a really quick note. I just want to touch on skirmishers just very briefly. I do feel like skirmishers are relatively straightforward in terms of tactics. If you disagree and you want to see a brief demo on how to use them, I can do that. But you want to go with your skirmishers. You really want to use them as guys that can pick off other infantry without being shot at. All right. How do you do that? You get basically like the Whitworth, for example, that has a range of 500. You're looking at your Lorenz has only got a range of 340. Harper's Ferry 1855 only has a range of 350. Let's see here. Even the Fayetteville, which is one of the best muskets in the game, only has a range of 400. Right. Now, that's effective range, so that doesn't mean that they can't fire further than 400. They can, but say you're going against somebody who has a Fayetteville, which is the best musket in the game. Their range is only 400. You got a Whitworth with these guys. Their range is 500, and there's only 150 of them, so you can really outfit, a unit with Whitworths and be very effective. And the way you use them is, in my opinion, because you're using such an expensive weapon, in support of other infantry. And so you set them up, to the flank of the enemy. And while your infantry unit is duking it out with their infantry unit, this guy's hitting the other infantry unit in the flank and shooting them. Or they're standing behind your infantry unit and shooting. But the key point is they're not the ones getting shot at. That's the best way to use these guys. I think it's very helpful to have a couple skirmishing units in your corps. Again, I like to use melee cavalry, and so then what I'll do is I'll supplement it with a couple skirmishing guys, and then what I do is I use these guys in support, and I support other infantry, and I give them these nice Whitworths with this very long range, so that they can pick off other infantry from very dense cover. And if they're getting shot at, they're going to suffer almost no casualties because they're outside the effective range of the infantry muskets, and they're in very good cover, and because their skirmishing units are fast, right? What you need to be careful of, though, is that they don't get picked off by their cavalry. So you just bear that in mind. Cavalry could swoop in and do some damage on these guys. And because these guns are so expensive, what is it? I think you can also get the Whitworth TS with the scope. It's 170 though. So very expensive, but in my opinion, very much worth it. All right, let's switch over. I'm going to do a couple demonstrations. First, I'm going to show you how to use skirmish cavalry in tandem against an infantry unit. Then I'm going to show you how to support one of your infantry units being charged, support them with a melee cavalry unit. Then I'm going to show you how to deal with other cavalry, one way to kind of do it. So we're also going to use a melee cavalry unit for that. Then I'm going to show you how to kind of keep your flanks clean with a cavalry unit. And this could be with skirmish or melee, but I do it with melee. But in that part of the video, we don't actually really engage the enemy at all. We're just kind of hovering around enough to keep their skirmish unit and their cavalry unit off our flank, so that our infantry can focus on the enemy in front of them. One thing I would note in that is that they do a really good job with their skirmish unit, and this is how I'd recommend you use your skirmish unit if you're going up against other cavalry, is move your cavalry up, but then have it supported by a skirmish unit. That way, if their cavalry engages your cavalry, your skirmish unit can get a volley off on their cavalry. It's a good way to do it. And then finally, you're going to see what we're going to see. It's the culmination of this video is going to be, we're outnumbered 2-1. We charge him, but then we bring in about 75 cavalry into his flank, and he collapses. So it's a really good demonstration on how even 75 melee cavalry can make an entire brigade of like 2,000 troops collapse, even though they have me outnumbered 2-1. Because hitting the flank with melee cavalry is very effective in this game, especially when that infantry is already locked up and nobody else can fire on your infantry on your cavalry. All right, hopefully you guys found that informative. If you have any additional comments that you guys want to add, please include them in the comment section. If you find this video helpful, please like and subscribe. Again, it just helps other people find this video. Hopefully it gets more people playing the game. And then if there's anything, as always, there's other aspects of the game you don't feel like I'm covering in detail or you're interested in or whatever, I can find the time to do videos on that too. So. Okay, so I pulled the historical battle of Cold Harbor since you start off with a bunch of skirmish cavalry, and I want to demonstrate to you probably the most effective way to use skirmish cavalry against infantry. Now again, skirmish cavalry are generally going to be operating on their own, independently. Yes, you can use them in conjunction with the infantry, but they're also very effective at operating on their own. Unlike melee cavalry, which probably should be operating in support of the infantry, if they're not out, picking off supply wagons, gathering intel, or picking off artillery. So in this part, I'm going to demonstrate how to use them against infantry. Now, bear in mind that infantry are pretty quick at getting out of column formation, which is what Martin is largely up here, and getting into line of battle and getting a volley off. So what that means is you don't want to be trying to shoot the infantry from straight on. What you want to do is hit them from the flank or the rear. The reason being is that the infantry are very slow at rotating once they're in line of battle, rotating from one flank to another, turning themselves. So by the time they turn and can fire on you, you should already be out of range. And what you want to do is generally I use them in conjunction with one another. I use two and I would probably recommend you do the same. You don't have to for this strategy, but I think it works best because then the infantry is going to have to pick and choose which unit of cavalry they're facing, and whatever unit they're not facing is the one you're going to come in and hit them from the flank. Depending on the difficulty you're playing, and also kind of, whether it's, 1-star, 2-star, 3-star unit, so forth, they could rout pretty quick because volleys from the flank are very demoralizing, especially when it happens in rapid succession and they're not able to get fire back. Okay, so probably Martin's the one we're going to do this again, but let's try it out. Or maybe Haggood. Maybe he's the one I can do this on. Yep. Okay, so notice here we've got 2 infantry, right? So we're going to get him out of there and keep him 1 down here because Davies is probably going to be the one that we're going to get the volley off with. We're using Merritt as the kind of the decoy. And I'm ignoring up here because I don't really care about that. This is for demonstration purposes. Okay, so I'm going to bring Davies in, kind of see what I can get off here. A lot of micro involved, right? Boom. Okay, so we got the volley off. Now we get out of there. I'm going to demonstrate to you. Notice how long it's taking him to turn. We're already almost out of range, and we were able to get a volley off. I bring him back in, but he's still kind of turned, right? So you don't want to come in with Merritt yet. Got to watch Haggood. And I like to use my skirmishing cavalry on the flanks, right? That's kind of like how I like to use them. Okay, so see if I can get off there. Doesn't look like I'm able to. Let's get out of there. And deal with him with my cavalry. Staying just out of range of his infantry. We get a volley off. Get out of there. Bring him in. Watch the reloads. Once he's reloaded, you come back in. See how long it's taking him to turn? And he routed. Okay, so that's how you do it. Constantly work the flank of the infantry or the rear. Keep yourself out of range. Just keep yourself close enough where you can keep eye on them because the fog of war can be an issue. Use 2, if you can, use 2 skirmishing cavalry units. And really work that flank and just keep yourself out of range. Constantly keep him kind of having to bounce back and forth on his line. And also, too, if it's close to the line of battle, these 2 guys here, because they're having to worry about this cavalry, aren't able to support Wolford right now. So you've got 2 entire infantry brigades that are not assaulting your defensive position because they're worried about these 2 cavalry guys over here. Let me see if I can work over Martin just really quick just to kind of further explain how this works here. So right now, that's his rear. So we're going to come up here. Now Martin's kind of moving back. So now we're in his flank, though. And we routed him. So there you go. That's how you do skirmishing cavalry. So I went and grabbed the Battle of Bull Run, the historical battle, just so I could demonstrate how to use melee cavalry. As you can see here, he's charging my defenses. It's 2 brigade against 1. And I have a melee cavalry here, equipped with the palmettos. And what you want to do is, generally with the melee cavalry, use them to kind of scout, kind of maybe harass the enemy artillery and supply wagons. But then also use them as support role, so you're not just having them kind of float around gathering intel. You kind of got them floating around waiting for an opportunity to support the infantry. So in this case, he's got these infantry guys committed to our 1 infantry brigade, and there's no other infantry here that could shoot our cavalry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to charge in here and schwack the 2nd Ohio. Okay, so we're breaking, right? And he's got about, 1,200 troops? And then watch what happens here. Didn't go perfect because I want my Louisiana Tigers to charge in there, but ow, so he shot me up pretty bad there. And it's because I can't get to my 1st Louisiana in there. And then you get out of there. So that's a pretty cheesy way to demonstrate, but best case scenario, right? So I didn't mind losing a bunch of my cavalry there since it basically saved my my line here from collapsing. But generally what you want to do is you want to do it so that your infantry is also supporting your cavalry and vice versa. So in that case, my cavalry was kind of on his own. But you notice here, he did get 90 kills. I just freaking lost my cavalry commander, but you got 90 kills and you saved your front. And so that's the best way to use your melee cavalry is literally in a melee role. They don't have as much flexibility as the skirmishing cavalry as you saw previously, but they do serve a purpose. They are cheaper and they're very fast. So I would note just from that one charge, not only did the 2nd New York retreat, but 2nd Ohio is routed and still retreating. He lost a bunch of troops. So even though the ratios here don't look great, we were able to collapse his attack there. All right, so in addition to supporting your infantry in a counter charge, or even an actual charge if you're the one on the offense charging the infantry, you also want to use your cavalry as a anti-cavalry, right? So he just had some cavalry come to the battlefield. I'm dealing with this infantry unit here with this guy. I don't know why he's firing there. So what you want to do is you want to bring in your cavalry to support him. And honestly, probably what I'm going to do here is I will detach. He'll fire at him. He'll fire at him, and then we'll bring the cavalry in to deal with the cavalry. So I'll wait till he bounces back to try and get a volley off, and then I'll charge him. Or not. Okay, so now he's coming back. So we're going to try and hit him in the side after he does a little volley, but he can't get away. The thing is, remember, cavalry's anti-cavalry just as quick. So he's actually going after my. Like, nope. All right, got in his rear. Now we're melee and he's not. So in this circumstance, it actually works out really well for us. He's trying to reload and run. And he's actually able to get away. And this is why you want to use two cavalry units, preferably. Instead of one, because it's hard to nail down another cavalry unit. But that's a good way to kind of use your cavalry to protect your flanks against other cavalry. Okay, now to further demonstrate how to protect your flanks with your cavalry, they don't need to be skirmishing or melee. They can either or. But in this circumstance here, you can see we've got we got 2 brigades, but he's got some skirmishers out here on the flanks, and you're going to want to flush them out and push them back, because otherwise you're going to be picking off your artillery or decreasing the morale of your infantry. So how do we do that? Again, you want to loop around and use the speed of your cavalry to do these big, wide looping maneuvers so that you stay out of contact with the skirmishers, but also can kind of get around on their side. You're not looking to kill any of them necessarily. You're just trying to push them out. I'm not really paying all that much attention to the infantry because the purpose of this video is not to do that. So see how if skirmishers already pulled back. So now what we're going to do is we're going to bring our cavalry in this side. The skirmishers pulled back because he saw the cavalry coming around. Hoping what he'll do is at some point he will charge. Alright, so there's the skirmishers. So we got a couple guys hit, so we got to be careful with that. He also has cavalry kind of roaming around over here. So you want to use your cavalry. I only have 1 cavalry, he has 2. So what you want to try and do is just keep tabs on this cavalry while at the same time acting as support. Got these skirmishers over here. So again, you don't need to actually be killing anybody with your cavalry to be effective. I mean, him over here is enough to keep these skirmishers back off your infantry flanks. So he's doing his job, even though he's not actually engaged with anybody right now. Then you gotta watch out for this cavalry here, because now what he's gonna do is he's taking this cavalry and trying to flush me out so he can get skirmishers in here. Yeah, it's smart. So now he's got his skirmishers behind his cavalry. So this way, if we engage with our cavalry, he's going to shoot us. So you want to pull back on that one. Then if his skirmishers fire, I should have stayed in the trees here. But so now that he's fired, now let's charge. So there's a good demonstration on how to protect your flanks without actually, it looked like we weren't doing a whole lot, but in reality we were. We're keeping their skirmishers off our flanks. We kept their cavalry off. And then when they pushed in with their cavalry to push our cavalry back, we pulled back temporarily. Probably should have gone more into the trees here. But then as soon as you volleyed, you charge them. And maybe you don't catch them, but you certainly push them back. So it's very much a cat and mouse game. So that's really kind of another way you can use your cavalry, in addition to, like we showed a little bit earlier in this video, supporting your infantry on a melee charge. But using your cavalry really to keep your flanks clear and clean. And then, vice versa, right? Doing the same thing, kind of harassing their flanks back and forth and getting them in a position where they can't maneuver as effectively. Okay, I'm just going to demonstrate once again how to support infantry with your cavalry. So in this instance, I've got about 1,200 troops to his 2,800. So I'm dramatically outnumbered, but what we're going to do is we're going to bring our cavalry into his flank to support a charge after we volley here. So I'm going to volley with him before I charge here. Okay. And then into the flank. So what we're going to see here is it's going to be kind of like a big, hand-to-hand here, relatively close, until we bring our cavalry in, and then it's really going to start dropping. So look at the kills go up big time here. We've lost one cavalry so far, 2. And he's routed. So there you can see he had more than twice as many troops as I did, but between my infantry charge and then supporting it with the cavalry, with the melee cavalry, it really made a significant difference, and the number of kills went way up, which is still going to happen here too. By the way, melee cavalry is really good for routed infantry, because they can get in some good kills. Just be careful because routed infantry doesn't necessarily always stay routed. You got to make sure that you get in, stab them with the pointy end a couple times, and then get out of there.